April 23, 1945. Midnight. A dark room in Lübeck, northern Germany. Heinrich Himmler, architect of the Holocaust, commander of the SS, Hitler's most loyal servant, sits across from Count Folke Bernadotte, a Swedish diplomat. Neutral ground. Outside, the Red Army is 30 miles from Berlin. Inside, Himmler is sweating. He says he wants peace. He says he can deliver Germany's surrender to the West. Not to Stalin. Never to Stalin. Bernadotte listens, takes notes, says nothing. Himmler thinks this is a negotiation, but what he doesn't know yet is that the world no longer negotiates with ghosts. For 12 years, Heinrich Himmler had been the face of absolute loyalty. He built the SS from 280 men to nearly 1 million. He ran the concentration camps. He orchestrated the final solution. He stood behind Hitler at every rally, every speech, every invasion. When others doubted, Himmler believed. When others conspired, Himmler obeyed. Even now, April 1945, Hitler still speaks of miracle weapons, still talks about holding Berlin, still believes in Endsieg, final victory. But Himmler, he's been watching the maps, the fuel reports, the casualty lists. He knows what Hitler refuses to see. And so, in the last week of April, while Berlin burns and the Führer rages in his bunker, Himmler does something unthinkable. He reaches out, not to surrender, not yet, to negotiate, as if loyalty could be bargained, as if betrayal could be dressed in diplomacy. Let's go back 2 weeks. April 10th, 1945. Himmler is still in command, still wears the uniform, still signs the orders. He's just celebrated his 45th birthday at his estate in Herrlingen. There was cake, there were toasts. No one mentioned that the Western Allies had crossed the Rhine. No one mentioned that the Soviets were at the Oder River. Himmler believed, or wanted to believe, that Germany still had cards to play. Here's what he told himself. The West fears Stalin. They need Germany as a buffer. They'll negotiate if Hitler is gone. So Himmler began to prepare. He met with his personal masseur, Felix Kersten, a Finnish man with connections to Swedish diplomats. He floated ideas, tested words. What if there were a new government? What if we could guarantee order in the West? Kersten listened, reported back to Stockholm. Meanwhile, Himmler kept visiting the front, kept giving speeches about holding the line, kept sending boys with rifles to face Soviet tanks. He played 2 roles at once: loyal servant, secret traitor. And for 2 weeks, he thought he could do both. But loyalty, real loyalty, doesn't split. It shatters. Let's talk about what Himmler actually knew in April 1945. Because this wasn't ignorance. This was denial dressed as strategy. Here are the numbers he saw every morning. The Eastern Front. Soviet forces, 2.5 million men closing on Berlin. German forces, 300,000, mostly Volkssturm, old men and teenagers. Ammunition reserves, 3 days. Fuel reserves, none. The Western Front, American, British, Canadian forces, 4 million. German forces, scattered, retreating, surrendering by the division. Rhine crossings, complete. Ruhr Pocket, 300,000 Germans surrounded, starving. The Luftwaffe, operational aircraft, fewer than 1/500. Fuel for those aircraft, enough for 2 sorties. Allied air supremacy, total. Berlin itself, population 2.5 million, half of them refugees. Defenses, old men, Hitler Youth, foreign SS volunteers. Food supplies, 2 weeks, maybe 3. Water mains, shattered by bombing. Think about that. Himmler saw these reports, every day. He knew the Red Army would reach Berlin by May. He knew there would be no relief. He knew Hitler's miracle weapons were fantasy. And yet, on April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, Himmler stood in the Führer bunker and swore his loyalty. Mein Führer, we will hold. He said it in front of Goebbels, in front of Bormann, in front of Hitler himself. Then he left, drove north, and made his call to Sweden. Here's what he proposed. Germany would surrender to the Western Allies, not to the Soviet Union. Himmler would guarantee order. The SS would become a police force to prevent chaos. In exchange, no war crimes trials for the SS leadership. He actually said that. No trials. This is a man who oversaw the murder of 6 million Jews, who built Auschwitz, who ran Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, and he thought he could negotiate immunity. Why? Because he still believed he had value. Because he thought the West needed him more than they hated him. Because he couldn't imagine a world where power, his power, meant nothing. But here's the truth he didn't see. The Allies had already decided. At Yalta, February 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin agreed. Unconditional surrender. No separate peace. No deals with Nazis. Himmler didn't know about Yalta, or he didn't believe it applied to him. So when Count Bernadotte sat across from him on April 23rd, when Himmler laid out his terms, when he spoke of order and stability, Bernadotte nodded, took notes, promised to relay the message. And Himmler thought, it's working. He drove back south, back toward Hitler's bunker, back to his double life. He didn't know yet. The message would reach Churchill within 24 hours. Churchill would reject it within 12. And the world would learn one final truth about Heinrich Himmler. He wasn't powerful. He wasn't indispensable. He was just a man who'd run out of time. April 27th, 1945. Himmler is at a safe house near Plön, waiting. He's heard nothing from Sweden, no confirmation, no reply. He tells himself it's protocol. Diplomacy takes time. But then, a radio broadcast. Reuters. London. Heinrich Himmler has attempted to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies. His offer has been rejected. Unconditional surrender to all Allied powers remains the only acceptable terms. The room goes quiet. Himmler stares at the radio. Not might be rejected. Was rejected. But worse, the broadcast named him. Churchill announced it publicly, told the world that Himmler had tried to betray Hitler, told Stalin too. Himmler's face drains, because now everyone knows. Hitler will know. And in that moment, sitting in that room, listening to his name on the radio, Himmler understands something he spent 2 weeks avoiding. He's not negotiating. He's begging. And no one wants him. Not the West, not the East, not even his own side. Think about that. He had built an empire of fear. He had commanded armies. He had decided who lived and who died. And now, he's a fugitive. Within hours, Himmler learns that Hitler knows. The Führer, locked in his bunker, Berlin shaking apart around him, issues an order. Himmler is a traitor. Strip him of all ranks. He is to be arrested and executed. Göring had tried to negotiate. Hitler called him a traitor. Now Himmler. The two most loyal men in the Reich, both cast out in the same week. Himmler burns his SS uniform, shaves his mustache, puts on a Wehrmacht private's coat, no insignia, takes a false name, Heinrich Hitzinger. He plans to disappear, to vanish into the chaos of Germany's collapse. Maybe reach Bavaria, maybe hide in the mountains. But here's what he doesn't realize yet. The world is very small now, and there's nowhere left to hide. On May 7th, Germany surrenders. Himmler is still moving, south, west, anywhere. He's with a small group of SS officers, all disguised. They reach a British checkpoint near Bremervorde. The soldiers stop them, check papers. Himmler gives his false name, tries to act ordinary. But one of the soldiers, looking closer, sees something in his face. They take him aside, search him. In his coat, a vial of cyanide, sewn into the lining. They bring him to a house for interrogation. A British officer asks his name. Himmler hesitates, then says quietly, "Heinrich Himmler." The room freezes. The officer, Captain Tom Sylvester, doesn't believe him at first. Himmler removes a patch over his eye, looks directly at him. "I am Heinrich Himmler." They prepare to transfer him, to hold him for trial. And that's when Himmler bites down. The cyanide capsule, hidden in his mouth. He collapses, dies in minutes. No trial, no testimony, no reckoning, just silence. So let's ask the question. Could Himmler's plan ever have worked? Could he have negotiated his way out? No. Here's why. First, the Allied agreement at Yalta. The Allies made a pact in writing. No separate peace. No deals with individual Nazi leaders. Unconditional surrender to all Allied powers, including the Soviet Union. Churchill couldn't break that, even if he wanted to. Roosevelt had signed it. Stalin would never allow it. Any deal with Himmler would shatter the alliance. And in April 1945, with victory in sight, no Western leader was willing to risk that. Second, Himmler's value was gone. Himmler thought he was offering stability, order, control of the SS. But what the Allies saw was this. Germany was already defeated. Berlin was surrounded. The Wehrmacht was surrendering in pieces. Himmler had nothing left to trade. No army, no leverage, no cards. He was negotiating with an empty hand. Third, the crimes. By April 1945, the Allies knew. They'd liberated Majdanek in July 1944, Auschwitz in January 1945, Bergen-Belsen in April 1945. They'd seen the gas chambers, the crematoria, the mass graves. They knew who built them. Himmler's name was on every document, his signature on every order. There was no immunity for that, no amnesty, no negotiation. The Nuremberg trials were already being planned. Himmler would have been defendant number one, and he knew it. That's why he carried cyanide. Fourth, Hitler's paralysis. Even if the Allies had wanted to deal, even if they'd been willing to talk, Hitler would never have allowed it. Himmler's entire plan depended on Hitler dying or being removed. But Hitler wasn't dead. He was in the bunker, still giving orders, still demanding loyalty. As long as Hitler lived, Himmler couldn't act. And by the time Hitler died, April 30th, Himmler's betrayal was already public. He'd been denounced, stripped of rank, declared a traitor. He had no authority to negotiate anything. So what was Himmler really doing? Not negotiating, fantasizing. He was a man who'd spent 12 years inside a bubble of absolute power, where his word was law, where fear made him untouchable. And he couldn't accept that the bubble had burst. He kept acting like he mattered, kept believing the Allies needed him, kept thinking loyalty could be rewritten. But the truth is simpler. Himmler had always been replaceable. Hitler knew it. The Allies knew it. The only person who didn't know it was Himmler himself. And by the time he realized, sitting in that room, hearing his name on the radio, it was far too late. The machine of history had already moved on, and Heinrich Himmler was just debris. Let's talk about what Himmler's betrayal revealed, because this wasn't just one man breaking. This was the entire structure of the Third Reich collapsing from within. In the final 2 weeks of April 1945, the Nazi leadership disintegrated. April 20th, Hermann Göring, Hitler's designated successor, sends a telegram asking if he should assume leadership. Hitler calls it treason, orders his arrest. April 23rd, Himmler meets with Bernadotte, tries to negotiate. April 27th, Himmler's betrayal is broadcast worldwide. Hitler strips him of all ranks. April 28th, Hitler marries Eva Braun, writes his will, names Admiral Dönitz as his successor, not Göring, not Himmler. April 30th, Hitler dies by suicide. May 1st, Goebbels dies by suicide. May 7th, Germany surrenders. May 23rd, Himmler dies by suicide. Think about that. The entire top tier of Nazi leadership, gone in 3 weeks, not killed in battle, not captured by the enemy, destroyed by themselves. Because loyalty, it turns out, only works when power does. When the power fades, when the machine stops, loyalty becomes a weight, and everyone drops it. Göring tried to escape it by seizing control. Himmler tried to escape it by negotiating. Goebbels tried to escape it by dying beside Hitler. None of it worked. Because the Reich wasn't built on loyalty, it was built on fear. And when fear stops working, when the man at the top can no longer protect you, everyone scatters. Himmler spent his last days as a ghost. No uniform, no rank, no name. Just a man in a private's coat, trying to vanish. And when he was finally caught, when he couldn't run anymore, he chose the cyanide. Not because he was brave, because he knew what came next. The trials, the testimony, the reckoning. He knew what the world would do to him, and he couldn't face it. So he bit down and disappeared. Not into history, into nothing. April 23rd, 1945. A dark room in Lübeck. Heinrich Himmler thought he was negotiating the future, but he was already the past. Here's the lesson. Power is not loyalty. Loyalty is not value. And when the system you built collapses, when the machine you served stops running, no one remembers your loyalty. They remember what you did. Himmler built the camps. He signed the orders. He turned ideology into industry. And when the end came, when he tried to trade that for survival, the world said no. Not because they were merciful, because they didn't need him. There's a photo of Himmler's body. British soldiers standing over him, his face slack, his eyes open. They buried him in an unmarked grave. Somewhere in the woods near Lüneburg. No stone, no name, no record. Because even in death, he wasn't worth remembering. The Reich he served is gone. The loyalty he claimed is forgotten. The power he wielded is dust. And all that remains is this. On a spring night in 1945, a man who thought he could negotiate with history learned that history doesn't negotiate. It moves, and it buries those who can't keep up. Even the loyal had begun to flee the ghost of defeat. But by the time they ran, the ghost had already caught them. Spring 1944. A windowless room beneath the Reich Air Ministry in Berlin. German intelligence analysts spread reconnaissance photographs across the table. Their task was straightforward. Identify the critical nodes in American industrial production. The targets that, if destroyed, would cripple the enemy's war machine. They knew how this worked. Germany had perfected strategic bombing doctrine. Find the centers, hit them hard. The system collapses. Detroit, Pittsburgh, Chicago, the great steel cities. The plan was simple, but as they traced supply lines across their maps, as they tallied factory locations and production capacities, something began to trouble them. The numbers didn't add up. This was the first warning. More precisely, the numbers added up to something impossible. Something that suggested they were not looking at a system they could break, but at one that had no center to strike, and therefore could not be stopped. German strategic bombing was rooted in simple logic that had worked across Europe. Industrial power concentrated itself. Cities grew around coal deposits, rivers, ports. Factories clustered where resources met transportation. This created vulnerabilities. This created targets. The Luftwaffe had studied British industry during 1940 and 1941. Coventry, Birmingham, Manchester. The pattern was clear. Destroy the concentrated nodes, and the system faltered. British tank production, aircraft assembly, ball-bearing manufacturing. All depended on a small number of critical facilities. When German intelligence turned to America, they expected the same pattern at larger scale. The American industrial heartland was well known. Detroit for automobiles and tanks, Pittsburgh for steel, Chicago for artillery shells. Initial reports confirmed their assumptions. Ford, General Motors, U.S. Steel, all maintained primary facilities in traditional centers. The targeting lists were drawn with confidence. Take out 20 facilities, cut American tank production by 60%, destroy 15 key steel mills, strangle raw material supply. Germany expected a larger Britain. What they found was something else entirely. The first anomalies appeared in 1942 intelligence reports. German agents still operating in the United States began sending back information that didn't fit. A factory producing bomber components in Wichita, Kansas. Not a major industrial city, not close to the coast, just sitting there in wheat country, churning out B-29 parts. Another report. A massive plant producing artillery shells outside Fort Worth, Texas. Why Texas? No major steel production nearby. Yet the facility operated at full capacity. Then Ohio. Not Cleveland or Cincinnati, those made sense. But smaller Midwestern towns expanding far beyond their traditional industries. Toledo suddenly producing Jeep components in facilities that hadn't existed 18 months earlier. Berlin dismissed these as secondary facilities. Support infrastructure. Surely the real production remained in traditional centers. But the reports kept coming. Factories where factories should not exist. And no one in Berlin could explain why. Production facilities in places without the prerequisites for heavy manufacturing. No coal nearby, no iron ore, no dense rail networks. And yet they were producing, in volume. Berlin assumed these were outliers. They weren't. Early 1943. A report landed on the desk of Luftwaffe intelligence that couldn't be explained away. An agent had obtained documents showing the United States was constructing new manufacturing facilities at a rate 5 times faster than German analysts predicted possible. Not expansions of existing plants, entirely new factories. Bare ground to full production in under a year, sometimes under 6 months. The report described shadow factories, government-owned facilities built across the country, staffed by private corporations, but funded by federal investment. Companies could expand without financial risk or construction delays. But this was only the beginning. When German analysts mapped the new facilities, a pattern emerged that violated every principle of industrial efficiency they understood. Tank assembly in one state, engine production in another, transmission manufacturing in a third, components shipping hundreds of miles before final assembly. It was inefficient. It was illogical. It was intentional. The Americans were building a system that couldn't be decapitated, not because it was well defended, but because it had no head to cut off. One analyst wrote in a memo, "They are building redundancy into every stage of production. It is as if they expect us to bomb them and have designed their entire system around that assumption." The memo was marked urgent. It requested immediate strategic reassessment. It was filed and ignored. Germany had never encountered anything like this. Autumn 1943. A meeting in Berlin. Present, senior Luftwaffe officers, intelligence analysts, members of Albert Speer's armaments ministry. The purpose: review target lists for a hypothetical bombing campaign against the United States. One analyst presented updated assessments. 2 years of intelligence compiled into a comprehensive picture. He began with expected targets: Detroit, Pittsburgh, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles. Then he presented his calculations. If New York's industrial capacity was completely destroyed, American production would decrease by approximately 8%. Detroit, 12%. Chicago, 9%. Pittsburgh, 6%. The numbers were read aloud twice. Several officers refused to believe what they were hearing. Someone asked the obvious question: what percentage of American capacity resided in the top 20 cities? The analyst consulted his notes. 43%. Long silence. Then someone asked a different question, a harder question. What percentage would need to be destroyed to reduce their war production by half? The analyst had run the calculations multiple times, checking his work because he hadn't believed the answer. 78%. Another silence. Longer this time. A calculation like this did not just challenge doctrine, it shattered it. One officer, a veteran of strategic bombing campaigns against Britain and Russia, said what everyone was thinking. Das ist unmöglich. That is impossible. You cannot destroy 78% of a continental nation's capacity from the air. It was not a matter of aircraft or bombs or courage. It was mathematics, geography, the fundamental limitation of strategic air power. A different officer spoke. His voice was quiet. Wir können sie nicht brechen. We cannot break them. For the analysts in Berlin, this was not just a report. It was the end of a worldview they had trusted for a lifetime. Over the following months, German intelligence worked to understand what they were seeing. And then came the evidence they could no longer ignore. Bomb a factory? Americans had refined reconstruction techniques to rebuild destroyed facilities within 90 days. They had studied German bombing of Britain, learned from British mistakes, pre-positioned reconstruction materials. Target the railroads? American logistics had shifted to truck-based networks. A massive commercial truck fleet could reroute around destroyed rail lines within hours. Strike the major ports? American war material flowed through more than 50 coastal facilities and dozens of river ports. Closing one port simply redirected traffic. The system flexed, adapted, continued. Attack the major corporations. Ford and General Motors were indeed critical, but they had subcontracted component manufacturing to thousands of smaller firms. A typical tank contained parts from 40 to 60 different suppliers. A bomber might source components from more than 100. Destroy the Ford River Rouge complex, the largest integrated factory in the world. And Ford would continue producing vehicles using its network of suppliers and assembly facilities. The Americans had done something unprecedented. They had built a war economy designed to be resilient against strategic attack, not through hardening or defense, but through distribution. Every German doctrine assumed that production systems concentrated themselves, that they could be broken by striking the center. America had built a system with no center to strike. For the German officers studying American production, the realization was professionally devastating. Years of doctrine were obsolete. The strategic bombing campaigns they had planned were fundamentally flawed, but it represented something larger. Some analysts began to understand that they were witnessing not just a difference in organization, but a difference in how Americans thought about war itself, about vulnerability. European warfare had always been about finding the weakness, the exposed flank, the supply line, the critical fortress. Centuries of military tradition taught that every system had a point of failure. The Americans had built a system assuming every point would eventually be struck, and they had designed accordingly. It was a different philosophy entirely, not invulnerability through strength, but resilience through distribution. One intelligence officer wrote in his diary, recovered after the war, that studying American industry had changed his understanding of the modern world. They have industrialized redundancy itself. We thought wars were won by those who could strike hardest. They understood wars are won by those who can absorb damage and continue functioning. By 1944, the strategic question of bombing American factories was academic. Germany would never have the capacity. The Luftwaffe was fighting for survival over Europe. American bombers ranged freely over German skies, systematically dismantling the concentrated base that German strategy had always depended upon. The irony was not lost on the analysts. German production remained vulnerable because it was concentrated, built according to principles that had worked for a century. American production was less efficient in the classical sense. Shipping components hundreds of miles added cost and complexity. But efficiency had never been the goal. Survival was the goal. The lesson was not about production numbers, though those were staggering. It was not about technological superiority, though American methods were innovative. It was about understanding that in modern warfare, the system that cannot be broken defeats the system that can, regardless of which appears more powerful. German strategic bombing doctrine had been developed to fight powers that looked like Germany. Concentrated, efficient, vulnerable. It had never considered fighting a power that deliberately chose distribution over efficiency. By the time German intelligence understood what they were facing, the war was already decided, not by any single battle, but by a fundamental mismatch in how two systems had been designed. One system was built to strike hard. The other was built to never stop. And in total war, the system that cannot be stopped will always outlast the system designed to strike decisively. The German analysts had been right to worry when their numbers didn't add up. The numbers were telling them something true. They were facing an enemy who had solved a problem they hadn't even understood existed. They couldn't find the center of American industry because it had none. That was the difference. That was the advantage. And that was why America could not be bombed into submission.